Richard Blackwood was a 48-year-old man who lived in Ridgewood, Colorado. He was a well-known attorney who worked for a prestigious law firm called Blackwood and Associates. Richard had a reputation for being charismatic and approachable, which made him popular with his clients and colleagues. He had a law degree from the University of Colorado and had been practicing law for over 25 years. Richard was married to Anne Blackwood. Richard and Anne seemed to be a happy couple. Richard was Anne's first husband, and they had a daughter named Emma, who was 21, and in her final year at the University of Colorado, studying journalism. Richard had a close relationship with them, or so it seemed to everyone around them. Outside of work, Richard loved photography. He often took trips to capture the stunning landscapes of Colorado. His friends at the local photography club remembered him as someone who was always eager to share tips and help others improve their skills. In the days before his death, Richard was involved in a high-profile case. He was working hard to defend a client accused of corporate fraud. This case was very important to him and his career. He was also planning a surprise vacation for Anne to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary. He had booked a week in Aspen and bought tickets to a special art exhibit. He even picked out a beautiful pendant at a local jewelry store as a gift for Anne. Despite his busy schedule, Richard made time to visit the local coffee shop every morning. He enjoyed reading the paper and chatting with the baristas. His favorite drink was a cappuccino. On September 18, 2019, 2 days before his death, Richard was seen at the cafe, smiling and talking about his plans for the anniversary. He seemed happy and satisfied with life. Richard's life seemed perfect on the outside, but there were hidden problems. His wife Anne had been acting anxious and distracted lately. She had noticed changes in their daughter Emma's behavior and was suspicious of Richard's frequent late-night meetings. Friends and neighbors had begun to notice the tension in the Blackwood household. On September 20th, 2019, at approximately 7 a.m., Richard Blackwood's body was discovered. The person who found him was his neighbor, Margaret Hill. Margaret was a 62-year-old retired nurse who lived next door to the Blackwoods. Anne had called Margaret, worried because she hadn't heard from Richard since the night before. She was out of town visiting a friend and asked Margaret to check on her husband. Margaret knocked on the door of the Blackwood house, but there was no answer. Noticing that Richard's car was in the driveway, she decided to try the door. To her surprise, the door was unlocked. As she stepped inside, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. The house was unusually quiet. Margaret called out for Richard but got no answer. She walked through the living room and into the kitchen, where she saw signs of a struggle, overturned chairs and broken glass on the floor. She followed the trail of chaos to the study. When she opened the door, she was greeted by a horrifying sight. Richard lay on the floor in a pool of blood. He had been stabbed several times with a knife that lay nearby, covered in blood. The room was a mess, with papers strewn everywhere and blood splattered on the walls and furniture. It was clear that Richard had been fighting desperately for his life. Margaret was horrified and immediately backed out of the room, her hands shaking. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she described what she had found. The 911 operator tried to keep her calm and asked her to stay on the line until the police arrived. Word of Richard's death spread quickly through the neighborhood. Pine Street was soon filled with police cars, and curious neighbors stood outside, whispering about the shocking event. Local news stations like KUSA and KCNC sent reporters to cover the story, and by noon it was the top story in Ridgewood. Margaret, who had been friends with Richard for years, was in a state of shock. She had never expected to find her neighbor and friend dead in such a brutal way. She later told reporters that Richard was a good man who didn't deserve such a terrible The discovery of Richard Blackwood's body marked the beginning of a complex and tragic investigation that would uncover hidden secrets and lead to shocking revelations about those closest. Police arrived at Blackwood's home shortly after Margaret Hill's 911 on September 20th, 2019. The first officers on the scene immediately secured the area, making sure no one entered or left the home. Soon after, detectives Laura Miller and David Roberts arrived to lead the investigation. Detective Laura Miller was known for her keen observational skills. At the age of 37, she had solved many challenging cases. Her partner, Detective David Roberts, was 45 and known for his methodical approach. Together they made a formidable team. As the detectives walked through the house, they saw signs of a struggle. There were overturned chairs and broken glass in the living room. The kitchen was more chaotic, with dishes strewn across the floor. When they reached the study, they found a gruesome scene. Richard Blackwood lay on the floor in a pool of blood. He had been stabbed several times with a knife that lay nearby, covered in blood. The walls and furniture were splattered with blood, indicating a violent struggle. Detective Miller noted the knife as the murder weapon and ordered it bagged as evidence. The scene was chaotic and disturbing. The detectives and forensic team took numerous photographs and collected samples. They used gloves to carefully pick up items so as not to contaminate evidence. Blood samples, fingerprints, and the knife were collected and sent to the lab for analysis. Outside, neighbors watched the police work. Local news stations were also there to cover the shocking murder. Reporters spoke with neighbors who described Richard as a friendly and well-liked man. The media coverage added to the pressure to solve the case quickly. Detectives Miller and Roberts interviewed Margaret Hill, who was still shaken by the discovery of the body. She described finding the door unlocked and seeing the chaos inside the house. Her detailed account helped the detectives piece together the events leading up to the murder. By the end of the day, police had gathered a lot of evidence but still had many questions. Who could be responsible for such a brutal act? Why would anyone want to kill Richard? The detectives knew they had a tough case ahead of them, but they were determined to find the answers. The first suspect in the murder of Richard Blackwood was his wife, Anne Blackwood. Anne was 44 years old and worked as a graphic designer for a local marketing firm called Creative Concepts. She was creative, meticulous, and hardworking. Anne had a challenging past. She became a mother at 23 and worked several jobs to support herself and her daughter, Emma. Despite these challenges, she built a successful career and was known for her resilience and determination. Anne had recently noticed changes in her daughter Emma's behavior and became suspicious of Richard's late-night work meetings. Friends and neighbors described Anne as increasingly anxious and nervous in the weeks leading up to the murder. Some said they heard arguments between her and Richard. Detectives Laura Miller and David Roberts brought Anne in for questioning on September 21, 2019. Anne appeared calm but was clearly upset. She maintained that she had been out of town visiting a friend and provided photos and text messages to support her alibi, but the detectives still had doubts. During the interview, Anne talked about her relationship with Richard. She admitted that they had been arguing more recently, mainly about his work and the amount of time he spent away from home. She denied any involvement in his death and insisted that she loved her husband despite their problems. The detectives questioned Anne about the night of the murder. She explained that she had gone to her friend's house on the afternoon of September 19th and stayed there until the morning of September 20th. Her friend confirmed this story when the detectives called her. However, they couldn't ignore the tension in Anne's voice when she talked about Richard and the changes she noticed in Emma. The police also searched Anne's car and belongings for evidence. They found nothing directly linking her to the murder, but they did find a diary in which Anne had written about her frustrations and suspicions. These entries painted a picture of a woman under immense stress and emotional turmoil. Despite her alibi, Anne remained a prime suspect. Detectives continued to dig into her past, interviewing friends, family, and co-workers. They hoped to find a motive or a clue that would link her to the crime. The pressure on Anne grew as the investigation progressed, but she remained steadfast in her innocence. The second suspect in the murder of Richard Blackwood was his daughter, Emma Blackwood. Emma was 21 years old and a senior at the University of Colorado studying journalism. She was known for her outgoing and ambitious personality. Her friends described her as driven and passionate, always eager to pursue her dreams. Emma had a complicated relationship with her father, Richard. It was revealed during the investigation that their relationship had evolved into a secret resentment. This resentment left Emma feeling conflicted and troubled, especially when she saw the strain it put on her mother, Anne. Detectives Laura Miller and David Roberts brought Emma in for an interview on September 22, 2019. Emma was nervous but cooperative. She admitted to feeling resentment toward her father, explaining that it had built up over years of perceived neglect. She said she had felt increasingly isolated and troubled, and her father had been too busy to notice. She insisted that she never meant to hurt anyone. During the interview, Emma explained how she had confided in a close friend about her feelings of resentment and isolation. The friend, whose name has not been released, confirmed Emma's story to detectives. Emma described the last time she saw her father, the night before he died. She said they had argued about his work and his lack of attention to the family. The detectives asked Emma about her whereabouts on the night of the murder. Emma said she had been at a friend's house working on a group project. Her friend confirmed this alibi and said that Emma had been there until the early morning hours of September 20th. Despite the alibi, detectives were suspicious of the emotional turmoil Emma was experiencing. The police also searched Emma's dorm room and her belongings for evidence. They found nothing directly linking her to the murder, but they did find several journal entries and notes detailing her emotional struggles and resentment towards her father. Despite her alibi and the lack of direct evidence, Emma remained a prime suspect because of the emotional tension and her troubled relationship with her father. Detectives continued to interview her friends and classmates, hoping to find inconsistencies or new clues. The pressure on Emma grew as the investigation continued, but she maintained her innocence and expressed deep regret for the strained relationship with her father. The investigation into Emma Blackwood had been thorough, but the detectives still had many questions. They knew they had to keep digging to find the truth behind Richard Blackwood's brutal murder. On September 26, 2019, 6 days after the murder of Richard Blackwood, police got a major break in the case. It was a cool, foggy morning when a hiker spotted a suspicious object in the park near Ridgewood Lake. He noticed a plastic bag partially buried under some leaves near a bench. Curious, he opened it and found a blood-stained jacket and a pair of gloves. He immediately called the police, and within minutes, patrol officers, Karen Lewis and Tom Martinez, were on the scene. They secured the area and called in detectives Laura Miller and David Roberts. The detectives quickly assessed the situation and bagged the items for forensic analysis. They were cautious but hopeful that this new evidence would break the case. They took the items to the Ridgewood Police Department Forensic Laboratory. Forensic analysts determined that the blood on the jacket matched Richard's DNA. In addition, the gloves had fingerprints that did not belong to Richard. This new evidence shifted the focus of the investigation. Detectives reviewed their list of suspects and re-examined their alibis. They also reviewed surveillance footage from the park and surrounding areas. This extensive review led them to a surprising discovery. A figure matching Emma Blackwood's description was seen entering the park late on the night of the murder. Detectives Miller and Roberts brought Emma in for a second round of questioning. This time Emma was visibly more nervous. She claimed that she had gone to the park to clear her head and had no idea about the bloody objects. The detectives pressed her for more details, but Emma stuck to her story, albeit shakily. The forensic team continued their analysis and found another critical piece of evidence: hair fibers on the gloves that matched Anne Blackwood's DNA. This discovery further complicated the case and indicated the possible involvement of both mother and daughter. On September 27, 2019, detectives called Anne back for questioning. She seemed calm but troubled. When presented with the new evidence, Anne admitted that she knew about the gloves, but insisted that she had nothing to do with the murder. She said she had worn the gloves while gardening and couldn't explain how they ended up near Ridgewood Lake. The police were now more determined than ever to solve the case. They knew they were close to uncovering the truth, but they had to carefully piece together the final puzzle. The discovery of the new evidence was a pivotal moment in the investigation, providing crucial clues and intensifying the search for Richard Blackwood's killer. The third suspect in Richard Blackwood's murder was his colleague, Robert Lang. Robert, aged 52, was known for his competitive and ambitious nature. He had a contentious relationship with Richard and had never approved of his success at the firm. Robert lived in Ridgewood and was a senior partner at Blackwood and Associates. Detectives Laura Miller and David Roberts decided to bring Robert in for questioning on September 28, 2019. When Robert arrived at the police station, he seemed unsure of himself and uncooperative. He had a reputation for being sharp-tongued and assertive. During the interview, Robert admitted that he and Richard had a competitive relationship. He described their professional rivalry as intense and full of disagreements. Robert expressed disdain for Richard, calling him arrogant and accusing him of overshadowing his own career. However, Robert vehemently denied any involvement in Richard's murder. The detectives pressed Robert about his whereabouts on the night of September 19, 2019. Robert claimed that he was at home working on a case and then went to bed early. There were no witnesses to corroborate his alibi, which made the detectives suspicious. The police searched Robert's home for any evidence that could link him to the crime. They found a few items of interest, including a set of gardening gloves similar to those found in the park. However, forensic analysis revealed no blood or DNA on these gloves. Despite his alibi and lack of direct evidence, detectives continued to investigate Robert's possible motive. They discovered that Robert had recently learned of Richard's involvement in a high-profile case he had hoped to lead, adding another layer of tension and potential anger. Friends and co-workers told the detectives that Robert had been particularly upset and vocal about being passed over for the case, calling Richard a traitor and expressing his anger to anyone who would listen. The detectives also interviewed Robert's neighbors, who reported hearing loud arguments coming from his house in the days leading up to the murder. One neighbor, Mrs. Campbell, said she heard Robert screaming about betrayal and injustice. Although Robert remained a suspect, detectives found it difficult to gather enough evidence to charge him. He was aggressive during questioning, but maintained his innocence. The detectives knew they needed more concrete evidence to link him to the crime. The investigation of Robert Lang added another layer of complexity to the case, as detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the events leading up to Richard's murder. On September 30th, 2019, a breakthrough finally came in the Richard Blackwood murder case. After days of investigation, detectives Laura Miller and David Roberts found a crucial piece of evidence. A surveillance camera at a nearby convenience store had captured footage of Anne Blackwood driving toward Ridgewood Lake late on the night of the murder. This was a significant clue that contradicted Anne's alibi. Detectives Miller and Roberts carefully reviewed the footage. It showed Anne's car, a black SUV, driving by the store at about 11:45 p.m. on September 19th. This placed her near the crime scene at the crucial time. With this new evidence, detectives were confident they had found Richard's killer. On the morning of October 1st, 2019, police arrived at Anne Blackwood's workplace, Creative Concepts. It was a sunny day, and local news stations, including KUSA and KCNC, were already covering the latest developments in the case. Anne was in her office when the police entered. She looked surprised but remained calm as they informed her of her arrest for her husband's murder. As Anne was led out in handcuffs, she protested her innocence, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. The resentment between her and Richard, coupled with recent tensions over their daughter Emma, had driven Anne into a fit of rage. She felt deeply betrayed by Richard's perceived neglect and their strained relationship. Detectives believe that on the night of the murder, Anne confronted Richard. The confrontation escalated into violence, and Anne grabbed a knife from the kitchen and fatally stabbed him several times. Anne's arrest shocked the community. Neighbors and friends couldn't believe that the creative, intelligent woman they knew was capable of such a violent act. Word spread quickly, with headlines in the Ridgewood Chronicle and segments on local news stations detailing the arrest. Richard's family had mixed reactions. Some were relieved that the killer had been caught, while others were devastated by the betrayal. Emma was especially heartbroken. She had lost both her father and mother in a matter of days. The emotional toll on the family was immense. When Anne was taken to the police station, she continued to deny her involvement. Detectives, however, were confident in their findings. The surveillance footage, combined with forensic evidence and Anne's conflicting statements, painted a clear picture of her guilt. The community of Ridgewood was left to deal with the tragic events. Richard Blackwood's murder had exposed deep family secrets and left a lasting impact on those who knew him. The police had solved the case, but the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. On November 15, 2019, the trial of Anne Blackwood for the murder of her husband, Richard Blackwood, began at the Jefferson County Courthouse in Ridgewood. The courtroom was packed with reporters from local news stations, including KUSA and KCNC, as well as concerned members of the community. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Mark Thompson, a 50-year-old with a reputation for being tough and relentless in the courtroom. He argued that Anne's motive for killing was her resentment and emotional turmoil over her strained relationship with Richard. Thompson painted a picture of a woman driven to the breaking point by betrayal and emotional stress. He presented the surveillance footage of Anne's car near Ridgewood Lake, the forensic evidence from the crime scene, and the conflicting statements she had given to the police. On the other side, the defense was led by attorney Rachel Adams, a 42-year-old known for her calm demeanor and sharp legal mind. She argued that Anne was innocent and that the evidence was circumstantial. Adams suggested that someone else could have committed the murder, perhaps out of jealousy or anger. She questioned the reliability of the surveillance footage and pointed out that no witnesses had seen Anne commit the crime. Throughout the trial, Richard's family sat in the front row, watching the proceedings with a mixture of anger and sadness. Emma, in particular, struggled with the emotional weight of the trial. She had lost her father and now faced the possibility of losing her mother to a long prison sentence. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict. On December 5, 2019, the jury found Anne Blackwood guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was read. Anne showed little emotion, while Richard's family cried and hugged each other. The local news immediately reported the verdict, and the story was covered extensively in the Ridgewood Chronicle. Judge William Harris sentenced Anne to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He stated that the evidence clearly showed Anne's guilt and that the crime was the result of intense personal betrayal and emotional turmoil. The judge expressed sympathy for Richard's family and hoped the sentence would bring them some measure of closure. Reaction to the verdict was mixed. Some in the community felt that justice had been served, while others felt that the sentence was too harsh, given Anne's emotional distress. Richard's family, however, felt a sense of relief that the ordeal was over and that the person responsible for his death had been held accountable. The trial and verdict marked the end of a tragic chapter for the Blackwood family and the community of Ridgewood. The murder and its aftermath had left deep emotional scars, but the verdict provided a sense of justice and a step toward healing. After Anne Blackwood's trial and conviction, life slowly began to return to normal for those involved in the tragic murder of Richard Blackwood. For Anne, now serving her sentence in the Colorado Department of Corrections, life took on a stark routine. She was allowed limited visits from family and friends, with strict rules governing her daily activities. Media coverage of the trial gradually faded, replaced by new stories and events in Ridgewood, such as the annual Thanksgiving celebration. Emma Blackwood, now 22, returned to the University of Colorado to continue her studies in journalism. She struggled with guilt and grief over her strained relationship with her father and the loss of her mother. Emma sought counseling to deal with the emotional aftermath and worked hard to rebuild relationships with her family. She distanced herself from the media attention and focused on her studies and volunteering at local animal shelters. Meanwhile, Detective Laura Miller received recognition for her role in solving the high-profile case. She continued her work at the Ridgewood Police Department, investigating other crimes and mentoring younger detectives. Detective David Roberts transferred to the Colorado Drug Task Force, where he used his investigative skills to combat drug-related crime in the area. The community of Ridgewood was still reeling from the murder of Richard Blackwood. Neighbors and friends remembered him as a kind and successful lawyer who loved photography. The local photography club held a memorial service in his honor, and a plaque was installed at the Ridgewood Community Center to commemorate his life and contributions to the community. Richard's family, especially his brother Michael, found solace in each other's company and support. Michael focused on his career and became involved in local charity events such as the Ridgewood Marathon. He remained vigilant about keeping his family close and supporting his niece Emma, who missed her father dearly. As time passed, the scars left by Richard's murder began to heal, though the memory of the tragic events of September 2019 remained a part of Ridgewood's history. The community rallied around the Blackwood family, offering support and understanding as they moved forward from the ordeal. This tragic case of love, betrayal, and murder serves as a stark reminder of the complexity of human relationships and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions.